Hey folks, so a more detailed video right now. Over the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of changes in the way that the card system for crafting and trading actions have changed. And I also have increased and actually completed the players module of the systems design. Um, in this process, some of the things we've talked about in the past have changed. And so I'm just going to give you a walkthrough of what everything kind of does, where it fits, and how this whole system has evolved. Because as it stands right now, it's baked in. This is what I'm building, and I'm pretty excited about it. So, um, to begin with, a little catch up on what the cards, how individual cards work in the trading system. So, the idea behind creating an action was to break down all of the actions kind of components and the way that those components add up to create an in-game action. That creates something that's craftable, that provides a degree of control for the player in how their character may perform something in particular. It's a way of customizing and personalizing everything right down to magic. So, what I've basically done is I've said there is a form of, there's some sort of operator or condition called an action. The action card is the thing that deploys the rest of the actions. So, you may have a strike action, for instance, and it would have an action size and an action cost. The action size is basically how much of an action it takes. Is it a full action? Is it a free action? Is it a half action? The action cost could be full, meaning it costs what the full mana, or it may cost double, or it may cost half. But there is some form of declaration that's in there. And then there's a series of operators which are always going to apply to the action as a whole. Then, within the trainer, these operations can then be replaced or reconstructed based on the other cards that you attach. So, for instance, if you have a strike, the rules would be different if you were to strike with two hands. This is what I call a technique. So, a technique modifies the way that an action is performed. Then there is a power. Is the strike delivering something like cryokinetic damage? That would affect the way that the damage is performed. And so the general idea here is that you have an action, that is the performative portion, a technique, that is the execution, and then the power is what it imparts. Then the power may leave something persistent, like a burning condition, for instance, on a target. The burning condition is something which is past, and so this is a condition card. There are also opportunity cards. Opportunity cards define when something happens, specifically the timing of an action. And in some cases, there is what's called an augmenter, which is something that ties into augments. So this is a fairly straightforward expression of the way that most actions are performed. The toughest part was figuring out how augments work. So augments are odd because they are persistent, like a condition. They are attached to a thing, like a condition. But they are process oriented. They are built around the construction of something. And so what I figured out was I originally had around 9 augments, and I've been able to distill them down to about 4. And I had to define what an augment was, not in a more, open sense of, an augment applies to a weapon or something. It has to be functionally different for the game engine to be able to understand it differently. So if we had like something like persistent condition that applies to, let's say, a weapon. Let's say you're carrying a sword and you want to augment it with burn, right? How does the system understand? How does the engine understand that you are not burning the sword, but that you want the sword to pass on that condition. This is essentially what an augment is. It's a rule change about a persistent effect. Instead of making the effect something which is assigned to the target, it makes the effect something that the target can then apply to something else. And so, when understood in this way, augments were a much cleaner and clearer thing. Things like affliction, which is compounding, creating some sort of poison that you are applying to something and then imbuing. Shroud, which is a projection, an aura that is passed on to other things. Immunization, which prevents certain forms of damage or conditions from affecting you. Or focus, which is a compounding of and concentrating of a power. These are ways that you are modifying a variety of different things, from objects to weapons to powers itself, to actions themselves. And so these became the only 4 augments that were actually worth making something unique. So that was very clear to me. After I dug in and started to understand exactly what was going on at an engine level. Then I came up with skills. Now, skills is the is the greatest volume of cards in a specific area. So there are a lot of skills. Some of them were more difficult to coordinate than others. Some of them I'm not actually sure how they're going to fit within the system, and will probably require some kind of custom code to be able to deploy them correctly. But in effect, these are your instants. These are your free action at any time kind of deployable things. So the way that I decided what a skill was as opposed to an action was, I said a skill is something which always has timing. It cannot be modified in the way that an action can by altering its timing. So you can't craft a skill. A skill is just going to drop into your inventory. It's going to be deployed at a specific point in time. Whether it shows up or not will be largely dependent on whether or not it's being fed back to you. So, you're going to have an actions panel where you're going to be able to take the strike action. That's going to be turned off and turned on based on whether or not it's your turn. But if something happens, which would normally trigger some sort of opportunity, there's a prompter that comes out that says, hey, you have an opportunity. Do you want to use this action? Skills can only be really used through that modality. And so they're a unique form of action because they can't be crafted, and because their only means by which to inject themselves is through the modality of the prompter. So there are a total of 183 cards that were designed. And through this process, I was able to develop the full systems design for both the session handler and for the player's module. So what you're seeing here is basically a class map of all the different classes that are involved in the engine. So what's missing from here are the engine components that represent the GM's module, the game master or dungeon master will be doing on their side. I've left these out from systems design because it becomes clear to me as I'm developing and creating the system that the smallest possible constituent of the system is the ability for units to attack other units. And so constructing a unit is basically what the player's module does. It's got other functionality that's layered on top of that to allow a player to be able to manipulate a unit and create a character. But all units have essentially the same logic to them. And so the way that I've structured this is basically, and I'll give you a nice little zoom in here so we can start navigating around. Some of these areas are not fully filled out. the structure is essentially what was the most important part. So we've talked about stats before. So the stat system is basically right down here, and it represents this. I became aware that there are different stat databases based on whether or not it's a weapon stat database, an armor stat database, or a unit stat database. So I have different stat databases which are meant to be held by different things. Then I have operations, which of course refer back to these. They're the constructions of whether or not they got requirement using modifier method. These are operators that are used by the system to be able to perform certain types of actions. So they have operation timer declaration, operation insertion, operation definition, the operation itself, the database of operations, and the controller for those things, and then a card definition and how operations can be built into cards. Then we have card controller and card database to be able to structure cards. That feeds into the training model. The training model feeds into the trainer, which builds into the training UI controller so that you can use it. The trainer produces a training dummy, which of course is then is the part of the action builder process, which defines what an action is, action definitions, and this is basically feeding into and creating a training dummy. The training dummy being the dummy action before it is fully trained through the training model and made into a permanent action. Actions may have dependencies for objects. Objects and their definitions are a part of this tree. Some objects are weapons, some objects are armor. Then we have the ability to create objects, which is the Forge system, which is mimicking in some ways the action training system. And so that's over here. That leads into inventory management. So the Forge builder feeds into the inventory controller. The inventory controller is able to control the definitions about the inventory and develop new inventory items. This creates the different databases for weapons and armor, which are inventory objects. Then you have an armor processor, the damage processor, which feeds back into the stat system and back into the armor because things can be damaged and hurt. All of this exists as part of the definition of what constitutes a character. A unit is a parent of character. So character is an extension of what a unit is. A monster is an extension of what a unit is. Monsters don't necessarily have all of the things that are underneath here. Characters do. And so we have definitions that clarify what a unit is, and then the unit is extended into monster or into a character. A character has progression. So progression is defined as this section right here. This is disciplines, species, card decks, card collections, discard piles, races, and then your progression mechanics like disciplines and discipline database, and the ability to control those things. In addition, we jumped right off here. In addition, oh, for heaven's sakes. We have conditions, we have area, bank, bind. These are mechanical components that are attached to characters and units that are persistent types of things. They need to be built into the character to be able to use them. They need to have a target. So one of the weird discoveries during my systems design was what is an active target. I originally thought that a target would just be something floating in the ether. I have since decided that characters and units will have targets, meaning that is what their focus is on. This may seem obvious, but the way I was originally conceiving of it was that there would be an active target floating somewhere in the engine, and that that target would be referenced and changed by whoever's turn it was. I became aware that if there was only one target inside the system somewhere in the session handler, it created a nightmare because if you had an opportunity action, character, for instance, would say, I'm going to attack this person, and that's my target. And then another person would say, well, I have an opportunity action, and I'm going to jump into that, and I'm going to reset the target. And I'm going to set the target as like, let's say the opportunity action was to jump in to provide cover for another ally to take the hit on their behalf. So that person jumps in and then makes themselves the new target of the action. And then somebody else has an opportunity which triggers a healing thing. Then suddenly the person who's healing has their target moved to a person who's not meant to heal. Then you're healing an enemy, and it's weird. So what I decided to do was to make every unit have a persistent target, so that you can say, like, your character dot target is this, so that we can understand who the owner of an action is and who their target is at any given point in time. That has to be built into the character. Then there's, of course, misfortune, the misfortune portion of it, and then there's the character creation suite, which is built on top of that. So, in short, not short, this is what the character module is. This represents a single unit within the classes of the game engine. How units interact is the session handler. We've discussed the session handler. There's another video for that. Things have largely not changed. The major thing that has changed is all these dependencies down here under the action manager. So the action manager is basically now the way that all things are changed. Every method, change a value, assign damage, roll this, do that, whatever. All that stuff is going to exist within the action manager. And so I went through and took all of the various forms of cards, and what I did was I searched through every single card to find every method that had ever been used, like whether or not you're using place or set dice or damage or attach or running selector, all these functions, and then I express them as part of the action manager. So there's going to be a library of different functions that are run by the action manager, and they're going to be run by the action manager through the session handler assembly, so that every single unit is independently modified by the same system. And that way, we don't necessarily have to worry about duplication of action managers or mechanical elements altering different things simultaneously, which could create a lot of complication. This centralizes that authority and makes it possible when we're playing to have less confusing interactions on a bug testing and QA basis. So this is what I've been up to since my last update. And right now, what we're doing is we're diving into the construction of this. I've been already into coding the game engine. We have 91 classes in the players module assembly and the unit assembly. And then we have 53 in the session handler. Of course, there's going to be a lot more once we get into the GM's module. Not even looking at that right now. What I want to do is get the unit working with the session handler, so I can set a unit up on this side, a unit up on this side, and have PvP interactions to be able to test. After that, I can start thinking about the way that campaigns work, about how to construct encounters, how to build monsters within the system, and then create an editor to be able to create campaigns within that context, and a GM to be able to officiate the different roles. So right now, my goal is basically to do these roughly 150 different classes and have them coded up. So far, I've only done 4 of the classes, and I did them yesterday. So my hope is that within the next 4 to 5 months, most of the classes will be cleared, and I will be into the testing phase of the game engine and starting to add the user interface elements on top of that. Because, of course, what we're talking about right now is the engine. We are not talking about the human machine interface element, meaning how you interact with them. So, anyway, in the next few weeks, you're going to be hearing more about the pains of building a game engine.